All right, folks, I think we've got a good number of folks. We're going to go ahead and get started, and folks can continue to join us as they step into the Zoom room. I'll keep reminding folks to drop their information into the chat, and we're going to go ahead and kick this off. So welcome, welcome. Couple of logistical and technical things. Attendees are not visible. We ask that you please respectfully use the chat to share your thoughts and send any tech issues to our BMP admin. And I want to give a huge shout out to Catherine, who has been instrumental in putting this webinar together. She's part of our Building Movement Project team, and she is the face behind our BMP admin today. So send any tech issues to her. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the link along with additional materials afterward. It'll be put up on YouTube, on our website. We'll share a blog post. So anyone who's not able to make it today can access the conversation and all of the resources. Again, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. You're welcome to do that throughout our webinar and this discussion. So anytime something comes up in your mind, feel free to put it in there. We'll be tracking those questions. And for today's webinar, it's going to be an hour and a half, 90 minutes. So we'll be finishing up today at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And towards the end of our webinar will be when we open up for Q&A from our audience members. So be sending in your questions throughout the webinar. For our agenda today, we're going to review some of our Building Movement Project research and report findings from work that we have done in the past. Then we'll lead into our panel discussion, and as I mentioned, we'll close with a Q&A from the audience. I'm seeing more folks joining us. Welcome, welcome again. Before I get into some information about the Building Movement Project, if you're just joining us, feel free to use the chat and drop in your name, your organization, and where you're calling in from today. We'd love to welcome you. Renee Villarreal from Santa Fe, Andrea Plaza, welcome, folks. So a little bit about the Building Movement Project. We are a national research organization, and we focus on developing resources and tools to support and challenge the nonprofit organizations to be more focused on and committed to progressive social change. We do work in three areas. Moving from left to right, we do movement building, looking at how organizations collaborate and work together to have a bigger impact than they would on their own. We do service and social change work, so developing the capacity of the human services to engage constituents in addressing the root causes of the conditions that impact them. And then we do leadership. So we look at how nonprofits can promote effective and inclusive processes and practices within the sector. So we are going to talk a little bit about the 2020 report that we did called On the Front Lines. And this was data from over 400 nonprofit leaders of color across the nation. We'll share some key findings, some testimonials and quotes, recommendations for philanthropy, nonprofits, and the government. So this was a survey that we did last spring to get a sense of how folks were dealing with the pandemic, and the report was released in October. And so, you know, this poll is a snapshot. A lot has changed. It's a real snapshot of the uncertainty that people were facing at that time. And we're going to go ahead and run our first poll for folks to go ahead and respond to. And at the same time, you'll see some of the key findings from On the Frontline Report. And so we'll leave that up. And then here we go, our first poll. 2020 brought multiple crises to the nonprofit sector and beyond. If you work in a nonprofit, does your funding increase, decrease, or stay the same? So we're going to give folks a couple of minutes to respond, and then we'll continue. And I'm seeing folks are still joining us, so welcome. Again, if you're just stepping into the Zoom room, please feel free to use the chat to put in your name, the organization that you're representing, and where you're calling in from. We'd love to welcome you as well. Feel free to use the chat to drop in any questions throughout our conversation today. So welcome, welcome. Okay, we're going to go ahead and share this data. So it looks like there was an increase, 53% increase, 22% decrease. Close to 20% stayed the same, and some are not sure. So thank you for sharing that information with us. We know that things have shifted since last year. And we're going to share a data point from the On the Frontlines report that showed that what folks saw reported that their organizations were on stable ground due to flexibility extended by foundation funders, emergency funds, and the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. So again, this was something that was very different. Last year was different in the sense of how funding went out into community. And so we wanted to share a little bit of this data point for you today. We're going to continue moving on to share a little bit of information from our 2020 Race to Lead report. This is data from over 5,000 nonprofit staff from across the country. We'll share some key findings, testimonials and quotes, and recommendations and opportunities for change in philanthropy and the sector. And so the On the Frontlines and the Race to Lead report, both of those are available for download, and we'll share those links at the end once again. The key findings from the Race to Lead Revisited report showed that the findings of the original report in 2017 are still relevant 3 years later. What we see is there's a white advantage within the nonprofit sector. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, what's called DEI efforts, are widespread throughout the sector, but people are really uncertain about their effectiveness. So those are some of the key findings. Again, you can download the report to get the full extent of all of the data that was collected. Again, that was over 5,000 folks that responded to that report. We wanted to share a couple of quotes that came out of this report. And so we thought it was important to show where folks felt they were being seen or not seen or taken seriously within the sector. And so we share a quote here from a Chicana woman who participated in the 2019 Race to Lead survey, and then a woman of color, ED and CEO. And so sharing their particular experiences around the challenges that they face being a woman of color in a leadership position. Which leads us to our next poll before we get into introducing our panelists today. We've got one more poll for you all to respond to. If you work in a nonprofit, have you ever had a woman of color program officer? We'll give you a few minutes to join. Or to respond, I should say. I'm looking at the chat. Lewis said, thank you for joining. It says that you're driving, so be careful. Again, folks, if you're just joining us today, thank you. We are hosting this webinar today, Women of Color in Philanthropy in New Mexico. Please feel free to use the chat to drop in your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. We'd love to welcome you to this conversation today. I'll just give you a couple more seconds here to respond to our poll, and then we'll share some results. All right, okay, so 81% of our respondents have had a woman of color program officer. 17% no, and 2% not sure. So that's good news. I'm a little surprised by that response, but I think that's exciting and something that we can definitely continue to explore in our conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome. Before I do that, okay, one more slide here. Thank you, Catherine. So before we move on, this slide just shows some of the work that we have done in the past year in New Mexico. And so we had the report, the Nonprofit Racial Leadership Gap in New Mexico, that was released in September of 2020. And then we've hosted 4 other webinars in addition to this one. All of those looking for ways to engage, hold space for conversations, and really lean into the leadership of the folks that are here in New Mexico. In addition to this work, we also have a program called the Common Good Action Project that we have been doing here in New Mexico for several years, and it's really looking at systems change and leadership development. And so that's another piece of work that we have been doing in New Mexico now for several years. So for our conversation today, I'm just so pleased and honored to hold space for our 4 panelists. We are going to be joined today, or are joined, they're on the call with us, Michelle Gutiérrez. She is a program officer with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We have Joanne Melchor, who is the president and CEO of the New Mexico Foundation. We have Nicole Rogers, who's the founder of Welstand Foundation, and our good friend Dolores Roybal from the Santa Fe Community Foundation, now on the board, but formerly with the Con Alma Health Foundation for many years. So I'm going to let them talk a little bit more about themselves once we get into the conversation. But again, welcome to the 4 of you. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of today's conversation. We are very grateful. So I want to move into our first round of questions and what I like to think of as the journey. And so I wanted to start with you, Joanne. And, you know, as a woman of color in philanthropy, what made you decide to take this particular journey?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joanne Melcher, and I'm from Santo Domingo, Pueblo. And I decided to take this journey because I've worked in nonprofits for over 30 years, and I was always seeking funding, writing grants, doing fundraising events, and a lot of the guidelines seemed to be restrictive in how we would run our programs. A lot of it was based on what the funder required. And so we would have to make adjustments in our programming to ensure that we were meeting the criteria and guidelines of the foundation. So, but a lot of it was based on Western views and goals of what that particular funder wanted to do. And so when I heard about this opportunity, I really wanted to make sure that, you know, I said to myself, I can make a difference. I can have impact in how funding can be distributed differently in philanthropy. And so I've been on the other side of asking for money and funding for wonderful programs and projects. And now I'm able to look at and support organizations, nonprofits, and communities, you know, with things that they are looking at, things that they need. And coming from Santo Domingo, Pueblo, a traditional conservative community, Pueblo, and I am very proud to be from that Pueblo. I really grew up with strong values of family, strong values of community working together, strong values of supporting one another. So a lot of those values didn't really fit in some of the foundation requirements that I had gotten used to in submitting my applications. And in some cases, I think that I was always kind of intimidated by some of the leaders in those foundations and organizations. And I felt like I always had to prove, you know, the work that needed to be done. And of course, as a fundraiser, you do that, you make those adjustments. But coming into this position, I really wanted to make a change and have impact in how philanthropy can do better, and have us start listening to our communities and better serve our people. And so it's been a wonderful journey so far. And last year we were asked to help organize and stand up the Native American Relief Fund through our organization. And in that work, it was wonderful to see community together, not only at the Native American community level, but also from national foundations and funders, individuals. And it really felt for the first time that going back to the values of helping each other, working together, it all seemed that way last year as we were growing the Native American Relief Fund. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been a great journey so far. And I think some of the challenges initially, I would say, is trying to understand what the environment is like when you come into philanthropy, and not knowing all of the different leaders in those positions. And I came in at a time where I think there were several white males in different positions that I thought, oh, okay, I've always looked up to and trying to understand what kind of work that they do, what kind of values that they bring to the work in the foundation. So that was, I guess I would say that I really wanted to learn about their own values, and then how they would try to help support our communities differently. Because a lot of some of the foundations, I would say, we're still working with the older model, or a different way of giving to communities. And I didn't really necessarily see alignment with what perhaps they were stating as the mission of their foundation. So that was a learning for me. And then fortunately, at New Mexico Foundation, I have a really strong board, and they have supported me throughout this journey and in my work. And one of the things that we have in our mission statement is what we value as a foundation, and what we value are rural communities, equity and fairness, local leadership and experience, partnerships, sustainability, transparency, and most importantly to me is respect for traditions and culture of all people, not just my own Native American communities, but all people in New Mexico. And I really want to have that impact in helping to support our all communities, not just communities of color, but everybody, so that we can meet our mission, and that is helping to transform lives here in the state and to make lives better. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the points that you raised, as we move through this conversation, we do want to get at how folks are dealing with the nuances and the challenges that they face. I wanted to turn it over to Nichole. And as you think about your journey, we've talked about earlier as we were preparing for this, what are some of the challenges as a woman of color as you've come into what is a newer journey for you, right? Having founded Welstand Foundation. So I wanted to see if you could share with us some of that story and what it is to walk as a woman of color within this world of philanthropy for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored to be amongst these amazing women, and I know who have a lot to teach me, which I would love to tap into later, because I think that's the biggest part of my journey, is the not knowing what you don't know. and women, when we break down even women of color, there are even less Black women at the head of nonprofits. And so when I looked to get mentors, that became really hard to find, a Black woman who, not saying there's none, but they're far and few between in New Mexico. And so that is a challenge, is finding other folks that look like you, that are doing this, that are willing to teach you the things that they learned, so that you don't make the same mistakes. Because I definitely over this 2 years have made mistakes. And I think my story was I was working at UNM Hospital and just seeing these huge gaps for kids of color, specifically Black kids, and just got sick of it and said, okay, what can I do where I can run the show and do what I think needs to be done to fill those gaps? And so I literally, a mentor gave me a list of how to set up a nonprofit, and I followed the list and just did it all myself. And I think that they're not having a mentor at the beginning when you're doing these things and learning, going to classes to figure this out. I was just appalled by the gaps and just wanted to do it. And so I think now looking back, I would have slowed down a little bit, taken some classes, learned some things first, because even setting up the foundation, I didn't realize, and I have to thank Conalvo for that, for teaching me the difference between how I set my foundation up as a private foundation versus a public charity, for example. Big difference in who can give you funding. And we didn't know that. I didn't know that. So I shot myself in the foot right away on being able to receive certain funding because of just how I filled out the paperwork, not knowing the difference. Little things that I didn't think were little became bigger as I went along. And so I think for me, balancing, the demands of the gaps that I see and the sense of urgency I had with the knowledge is super important. I'm excited that I had the zeal and all of that, but now I'm like, man, I really should have just waited and taken some classes because and especially in the Black community, for us, when we make a mistake, it affects our entire community. It ripples through our entire community. So I feel that weight on my shoulders that we have to do these things correctly, because it does have an effect on our entire community if one of us gets it wrong. So I think that's been a big barrier being a Black woman in philanthropy. I think that there's just a lot of knowledge gaps that I think we don't get taught, that we need to help the leaders of tomorrow that want to do those things. And I'm including that in myself, leader of tomorrow, because I still have so much to learn. But it's important. That knowledge is really make or break for our sustainability in this work, because there's so many nonprofits that come and go. And in Albuquerque alone, we're like #1 per capita for nonprofits in one city, which is, to me, was like, okay, that's interesting. So, how do we balance also the demands of what we want to do for our community, but also the funding demands? And like Joanne said, I found out really quickly foundations could get in the habit of chasing the money and adjusting their programs to follow the money, right? Instead of, this is what our program is, this is what we're going to focus on, and we're going to do really well, and we look for funding to fund that. I just was amazed at how much chasing of funding happens, and people change their whole thing just to get that money. And I've tried really hard not to do that. We don't take in a lot right now. I think we were less than $50,000 a year in funding that we get. And it's because I don't want to do that. I don't want to just run around chasing the money when I really want to find meaningful funding that can sustain us long-term. And that's really our focus now. So a lot on the journey, but I would say learn first before you do, because it's been a journey for sure, learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here and sharing your particular story and the challenges that you have faced and are overcoming, right? I mean, and I think one of the points you raised around mentorship is huge. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that later in the conversation. And then this piece around chasing the money, is something that we hear over and over. And I wanted to turn it to Michelle and, have you share with us your story and thinking about, how do you balance the demands of the foundation vision and then the accountability to the community that you serve? Like, what has that been like for you, and what has your journey been like?
Yeah, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. just a little bit of background. I'm calling in from Rio Rancho, which is Tiwa territory, and just really happy to be on the call today. In terms of my journey, I don't know if I chose philanthropy or philanthropy chose me. I actually was living abroad for about 10 years working with nonprofits and NGOs. And the country that I was working in, there was a civil war that started to reactivate, and it was time to move home. So that was in 2009. And I actually applied for a job at Quinalma Health Foundation with Dolores and got the job as a program officer and had absolutely no clue about how philanthropy works. And so thanks to Dolores and other folks, they were, able to help teach me about philanthropy, because there are a lot of rules, there's a lot of processes. There's even nuances in how you have conversations with grantees, because we're talking about money, right? And we're also coming from institutions that have power and privilege and wealth. And so how do you have those conversations in as equitable a way as you possibly can, recognizing that it's not always going to be equitable. But thankfully, Quinalma was rooted from the beginning in equity. And so that gave me a really good starting point. They've always served communities of color, tribal communities, rural communities. And so I was really blessed in that way, because I came into a foundation that already had those values. And, other philanthropic organizations may not have those same values, excuse me. So I was really blessed in that. And then I moved to the Nota Begay III Foundation, which was a public charity that also provides funding. But so to Nicole's point, right, like there's lots of rules and processes. And I was brought on to establish their first grant making program for Native-led nonprofits and for tribal nations across the country. And we had a lot of leeway to be able to structure our grant making around the communities first, and then the processes kind of were placed around that. So we focused on Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and that meant that we needed to treat our grantees as relatives. In fact, we didn't call them grantees, we called them community partners. Just another additional way to try and balance out, some of the relationships. And then we started to try and incorporate, non-typical things like encouraging Indigenous evaluation metrics and doing interviews and reports, like rather than do a narrative report where you have to write, because we all know that takes a lot of time and effort, but actually just meeting with the grantee towards the end of the grant and having a conversation and then capturing that information that way. So, I've been blessed, and I take that experience to the Kellogg Foundation, where I've been for the last 2 years. Yeah, next week will be 2 years. But balancing the demands, it's hard. It is, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, it is hard. I think, one of the biggest challenges as women of color in all spaces, but I'll just speak for philanthropy, and Joanne kind of mentioned it, is we bring a lot of expertise to this sector because we're from community, but we get a lot of pushback because we may do things differently, because our approaches of the work, they're not always from a white perspective, they're not always from a Western perspective, and they're not always centered in patriarchy. And so because of that, I think it's hard for folks to wrap their heads around, quite frankly, it just makes them uncomfortable, right? And that includes some of our other people of color, right? That lateral oppression that we talk about. We're so used to things being a certain way that when we push, we get pushed back. And so being in that space constantly as a woman of color in a place of power and privilege, quite frankly, it's exhausting. And I recognize that I have been given this opportunity, and this opportunity is not just for me, but for my people. And so for me, I stay in philanthropy because I'm serving my community. And I recognize what an opportunity this is for me, that I just, I need to stay here and make sure that I'm getting resources to our community.
Thank you for that, Michelle, and thank you for your honesty. I mean, I think it's so important for folks to hear that it is hard, right? It's balancing all of what you're balancing and the challenges that you're facing and how you're stepping forward to meet them. And I love that reference of how you're staying grounded in community. Ms. Dolores Roybal, I wanted to turn it over to you. You have recently taken on a new position, right, with the Santa Fe Community Foundation, moving from Quinalma to now another foundation in a different role. and just wanted to get your thoughts on that journey, and then what you've heard from our other panelists today, and what resonates with you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alicia. Also, thanks to Catherine for all your work in putting this together. And to my sister panelists, it's really a privilege to hear your stories. It's amazing how we work together, yet never take a moment to hear some of these stories. So thank you so much for sharing that. I have been in the sector, nonprofit and philanthropic, for over 40 years. The first half, like Joanne and others, Nichole, is where I started with nonprofits, working in nonprofits, directing nonprofits, and then subsequently moved over to philanthropy. My journey started in Española, where I still live. I am a longtime member. I was raised here. It's a small rural community in northern New Mexico. And I learned many lessons, even when I was young. And some folks may consider me a wise old woman, but I actually was a wise young woman as well. And, I think that's an important point, because wisdom does not just come with age. And I learned very young a lot of lessons, including understanding the concept of equity without ever even knowing the word. And I think a lot of people, particularly people of color, and can relate to what I'm saying. One experience is when I went to the University of Denver to work on my master's, my MSW. That's the first time I learned that I was poor. I'm like, well, what do you mean I'm poor? Well, you're the economic, income, the wages, the housing, all indicators from, where you live as part of a class assignment shows that, you were raised in poverty. And even then I disagreed. I said, well, I don't agree with that, because we all had our own homes, we had land, we had food, we bartered, we helped each other. And, who defines what wealth is? And so that was something I learned, early on. I carried those lessons throughout my work, regardless of whether I was with a nonprofit or Conalma, where, I just retired from serving a position there for 15 years. And I hope to carry it further in terms of some of those lessons and values of family and community and equity in the deepest sense to the Santa Fe Community Foundation, where I'll be privileged to chair the Programs and Grants Committee. And I think that, part of that carries over in terms of positions of leadership, that humility, that understanding that we all have a role. We all have a role in the work we do. And, one of the lessons I learned growing up is that every position is as important as any other position. The mayordomo is just as important as a school principal or the custodian. And these power, imbalance and relationship in terms of the nonprofit sector and funders, it is changing slowly, but it is changing. And it's because of people on the panel, it's because of organizations like the Building Movement Project that lifts up some of these issues. And it's because of people that are participating on this call that understand and have a vested interest in terms of using our positions of leadership and influence, understanding power dynamics, understanding how to use power, but also understanding how to not abuse power. You're on mute, Alicia.
Thank you. I just really appreciative of all of you sharing your stories and the particular journeys you're on. And, if you could think, Dolores, for 1 second around some barriers that exist that need to be addressed or changed within the world of philanthropy, If you could share a couple quickly as we move through this conversation. I wanted to talk about process and what it actually means to be in the positions that you're in.
Well, there's two levels in terms of the process issues related to philanthropy. Oh my goodness, don't get me started. I mean, there are so many changes. You know, Joanne talked about, Michelle, Nichole, everyone talked about it from their different perspectives in terms of what we need to do differently. And certainly COVID helped us make some of those changes, you know, simplifying reporting requirements, multi-year grants, general operating. There are many changes that are in place that we can continue with. In terms of the broader question of equity, in terms of women of color in philanthropy, what we're really talking about is structural inequality. And I think that the report that the Building Movement Project did in terms of really lifting up the issue that the barriers are not individual deficits. Let me repeat that. It's, the reason that there are not more women in philanthropy is not because women can't do it. You have the issue of motivation, capacity, and opportunity. We're talking about structural barriers related to opportunity. And I think that, that is something that really has to be lifted up because, everyone I know, it's not a matter of, working harder. It's a matter of identifying, naming, and removing some of those structural, racist, gender biases that we all have to deal with.
Michelle, I wanted to turn it over to you and get your thoughts because you work for a large national foundation and you started lifting up earlier some of the specific challenges and opportunities of being in an institution that is that big, right? And that's able to make sort of those big grants. What are ways that you are, advocating for your grantees to leverage that money, and then even just thinking about some of the things that Dolores shared around the structural pieces that get in the way?
Yeah, thank you. Structural barriers are real. No surprise, everyone on the call knows this. But I will say that while COVID has ravaged our communities, there are bright spots, right? And in doing so, I can just speak specifically through philanthropy that in all the years that I've been here, which is more than a decade, I had never seen the funders pull together the way they did during COVID. And I think a really good example of that was the HEAL Fund, or the Native American Recovery Fund that were hosted at the New Mexico Foundation. It was the first time I'd seen funders calling each other, like texting each other at night, trying to move quickly to move money to the communities. And so my hope is that because of COVID, because of Black Lives Matter, because of the civic uprisings that have kind of really kicked us forward, whether we wanted to come or not, we moved forward. And I'm excited to see what that means for New Mexico and the partnerships between the philanthropic organizations. I also, of course, am thrilled to see, even on this panel, but there are folks that are on the call like Dr. Amanda Montoya, Carla Romero. These are all women of color that have moved into philanthropy, right? So the sector, at least in New Mexico, we're leading in terms of seeing some of those shifts. In terms of, the Kellogg Foundation in particular, being a large foundation, we're the 5th largest foundation in the country. We've been around for 90 years. Some of our processes are slow, right? We have incredible grant making process, but because we're large, sometimes we could be a little too large, and that means that it takes a lot of time to be able to get money out the door. And then just as a large private foundation, and this isn't something that's on us, but is perceived to be on us, is really, IRS rules. So we operate a little bit differently than a community foundation. So as a private foundation, we have rules according to the IRS. And because Kellogg provides significant grants for the state of New Mexico, we have to be very careful with smaller organizations that we don't tip them, that's what it's called in IRS language, or jeopardize their grantee tax status. And so that for us is a major challenge in working in New Mexico. And so something that, you know, we need to continue to work on at the federal level to start to change some of these structural barriers that Dolores was mentioning, so that we are able to get capital out into communities, and particularly to our very small organizations and our BIPOC organizations. Yeah, and then just in terms of advocating for grantees, I mean, one of the great things about working at the Kellogg Foundation is that we are national, we're actually international, and so we have connections across the country. And so being able to elevate our grantees here in New Mexico at that national level, to give them exposure to other funders, but also to, you know, other sectors around the work that they're doing is really important. And most recently, I think Tewa Women United was one that we hosted a large call with the Kellogg Foundation colleagues, so that they can learn about what's happening, the brilliant work that is happening in New Mexico that, you know, is surrounded by culture and values and tradition, and may look differently in some other communities, but the essence of what we're trying to do and the struggles are still the same.
Thank you, Michelle. I wanted to ask you, Joanne, to talk a little bit in relation to some of the things that Michelle was just talking about, right, in terms of New Mexico and the unique place that we live in, and also the amazing history that is here still to this day, right, and being an Indigenous woman still being in a traditional community. You know, how does that impact how you look at funding? And are there particular challenges that you've come across balancing, you know, the funding world and then the traditional community that you are in? And what are there like specific needs that you've seen within tribal communities that might make it hard to access funding or create questions? Or, I mean, just what are you seeing and how are you addressing it within your community?
Thank you for that question. And I am so grateful for the feedback from my fellow panelists here. I just really appreciate what you've shared so far. And I think it goes back to who we are as Indigenous Native American communities. And for me, as an Indigenous Native American woman, growing up with my family and our Pueblo community, we have values that have been instilled in me since I was little, you know, growing up with my grandma. My grandma was a potter, and she didn't speak English. And I would sit with her. She was my first babysitter. And I would sit with her and she would talk to me in our language. And she would tell me, you know, show me and also talk about some of these values. And I would sit next to her as she was making pottery and she would describe all these different things. And you know, and throughout my life, you know, having relatives, having our community leaders, our traditional leaders, speak about some of those values and reinforcing what I grew up with and what I've learned. So the values of love, respect, working together and taking care of each other. And to me, if you have that in your heart and you want to do that for your people from all walks of life, it shouldn't be hard to be able to understand you know, ways to give and ways to give back to our people and our communities. And I think for me, coming into this position, I brought those values with me. And those are all the things that I think about every day. You know, I feel like I'm in this important role to be able to take care of our communities. And fortunately, I've been able to establish really great partnerships with not only the women on this panel, but with others in the community, McCune Foundation, Thornburg Foundation, Colnelma Foundation, and Kellogg Foundation, and others that have just really supported the work that we're doing. It feels like, you know, we are shifting, we are making this change, and to have that support around you has been amazing. So we've stood up the several funds through our foundation. I talked earlier about the Native American Relief Fund, and as Michelle mentioned earlier, you know, COVID, you know, ravaged our communities, and it's it's just so hard. It was so heartbreaking to go through seeing all of that, and then seeing how our Native communities had to struggle and continue to struggle with some of infrastructure needs. And so the partners that I mentioned earlier got together last year and started discussing, well, what's going to happen after COVID? What's going to happen after Native American Relief Fund? And so we started discussing creating the Native American Recovery Fund. And there's just so many needs in our tribal communities that, I mean, throughout the state, in all tribes, I would say. And the Native American Recovery Fund, we are focusing on 5 areas, looking at supporting infrastructure needs in the areas of health systems, ag and food systems, family economic security, opportunities for youth, and water resilience. Those are all the important areas that I think that we is needed and that we are going to support through our recovery fund. The recovery fund is a 3-year grant, and we posted our RFP on our website on September 16th, and the due date is October 28th. And we hosted a webinar to talk about, some of the requirements around applying for this fund. So we are looking at having Native-led nonprofit organizations apply to this fund. We're looking at tribes and tribal programs applying to this fund as well. And we've set up strategy tables for each of these areas, and there's community voice on each of those strategy tables so that we're not the one making decisions. It will be decided through that community-led discussion as to who will be awarded those grants. So there's just so many, different areas that that are important to our people. And I will say that, I am proud to say that our Native communities, have made it through this challenging and difficult time through our prayers, through our resilience, And I'm sure all of you and people on this webinar have heard about, our Native history. We've made it through really difficult times, and we're in another difficult period. And it's so important that we come back to those values that I mentioned earlier. We come back together and support each other, and just make things happen in order to take care of all of the different needs, not just for our Native communities, but for the state as well.
I think you're on mute again.
I keep muting so that I don't interrupt the speaker and then I forget. I would say, Joanne, thank you. And feel free to drop in the chat the link to that fund that you referenced. I think that's really great and important information. So thank you. Nichole, I wanted to turn it over to you to share a little bit of your thoughts. You mentioned earlier that, you created this foundation to address the needs of African Americans in the communities, right? And some of the challenges that you have faced. And you brought up this idea of mentorship and how important that is. In addition to that, what do you need to succeed in this particular field that you've now entered, and what would success look like for you?
Yeah, thank you. That's a loaded question, right? What do you need? And so I think the biggest thing I've experienced that drives the needs is here in New Mexico, there's still a very strong myth that we're a tri-cultural state, right? And that we're not multicultural, which erases the Black community altogether from the equation. I've had conversations with funders and lawmakers that have said, when I'm advocating specifically for the Black community, I've heard someone reference us as statistically insignificant because there's only 2 to 3% of us, right? How do you overcome that? And the way I overcome that is no longer relegating ourselves to a percentage. So in my applications for funding, you will not see, I'm at 2% of the population type language. It's going to be, No, in Albuquerque specifically, there's over 18,000 African Americans that live here. In the state, there's over 55,000 now that we have the 2020 census data, right? There's a lot of us here, and we're not statistically insignificant. I think that's the biggest barrier that really is stifling success, right? Like, we don't want to just fund for the 2%, right? Like, oh, and whatever we do for our Native American brothers and sisters, our immigrant and refugee brothers and sisters will help your community, right? Rather than allowing us to advocate for our community and not feeling insignificant because we're 3%. I think that's a huge barrier that drives a lot of our success. I think when it comes to what we need is in addition to the mentorship, right? Piece is, the ability to, I don't know how to say this politically correct, but what I've experienced is not a lot of people want to fund projects that are only funding for African American kids. Like, that's been my experience. I've had funders, and none of the ones that are represented here, so I just want to say that. But I've had some that have said, well, if you add Native Americans to your program, we will fund it, or things like that. I get a lot. And I always have to say, well, there's a lot of resources out for other groups in the state, but for my community, we tend to still be left out of a lot of the opportunities. And I think what Dr. Roybal talked about is the opportunities. It's not that we're not capable. It's not that we're not smart and we don't have great ideas. It's the opportunities to know what the circles are to get the information. Where should you add yourself to what listserv so you can get the grant notifications? How do you add yourself to be to get the notifications of the RFPs from the state, the county, and the city? How do you, all of those things, how do you even get a seat at the table to learn the information so you can access those resources? So I think that's a big thing is where to be able to go get plugged in to learn is, I think, the biggest need. I've heard of things like Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and luckily I've been able to get some help there, but I have to also shout out the champions who are not women of color who have stepped up to help. New Mexico Thrives, Sephora, she literally just said, hey, I know you're new. Hey, sit down, talk to me. When we were doing census work, she didn't know me. She didn't know who I was, but she took the time to explain things and help me. Kia Griff's from Albuquerque Foundation, she checks on me. Hey, how are you doing? Is there anything you need? What can I help with? So Bev McMillan at United Way, like, there's people who will help. But again, it's just reaching out to each other too, and helping each other learn what the opportunities are is something that we definitely could need for success. And what success looks like is to have a open group home for kids of color, for Black kids to come and feel like they belong, that this space is for them alone. That's what success looks like for us. But we don't want to do it until we're sustainable for 10 years or more. And that's the hard part. It's teaching us how to do that so that we don't have to send these babies back, to other places that aren't for them, is really what success looks like for us.
Thank you. Thank you for lifting all of that up, Nichole, for sharing that. This last part of our discussion before we move to Q&A from the audience, I wanted to get your all thoughts on, how do we address that leadership gap that we see, and, the strengths and opportunities that do exist within philanthropy for women of color. And so, Michelle, I'd love to get your thoughts on, what are the bold solutions? What are the shifts that you'd love to see, or that we could make as we think about addressing the leadership gaps and leaning into opportunities? What do you see?
Yeah, so first, we definitely need more women of color in philanthropy. New Mexico, maybe right now on this panel, looks great, but I pulled some stats just for today. So the 2020 Grantmaker Salary and Benefits Report says that in 2020, people of color make up 27.2% of foundation staff, and 10.3% of foundation CEO leadership roles. That hasn't changed since 2016. And then women comprise 76.5% of full-time foundation staff, but are significantly underrepresented at the CEO leadership level at 57.8, right? But that's not women of color. And not in a token, like, not in our tokenism way of just having folks there, but really thinking through diversity, equity, and inclusion to include things like belonging and justice, right, as part of that DEI work that we're doing. The second one I think Nichole hit home on, and that's mentorship. And not even, it can be mentorship, but it can also just be support networks, support systems. We need our own space. We need our own space to vent, to cry, to celebrate, to reflect, to check in. And I'll just share, because I think Daleen from Santo Domingo is on the call right now, and she's one of my sisters from the New Mexico Women of Color Leadership Initiative that the Santa Fe Community Foundation hosted. And I think I did that in 2019. I did not know I needed that until I was in that space. I think and when I talk about it, I still get chills, because we don't realize what we carry as women of color until we're in a safe space, and then all those layers of protection, baggage kind of come off to just be. And so I appreciated that space more than anyone could ever know. We did learn, leadership skills, like how do you negotiate your pay, equitable pay? And those were great skills for me to learn as a leader, but just being in that space. And one of the biggest takeaways for me in that space was do it yourself versus do it together. And I still have my sisters text me when I'm feeling overwhelmed, and they're like, DIT, DIT. So those reminders, I think, for our sector are really important, not just the philanthropic sector, the nonprofit sector, any sector women of color are in, are those support systems. And then the last is, I'd like to challenge us to really think about redefining what leadership means. I mean, the frameworks, the paradigms we've adopted from leadership typically are from white Western perspectives, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are, important learning, but we're usually trying to indigenize, colorize, genderize all of these frameworks, these paradigms, and these values, rather than just defining what we want leadership to be. And leadership for me, I don't know how many of you will follow Adrienne Marine Brown or Edgar Villanueva, but they talk about leadership in terms of the birds, right, and the V shape, right? And when a bird at the very top, when it's their turn, they move to the side, they move into the row, and then the next person comes up. And so, just really thinking through leadership and what that means for New Mexico and for our women of color in New Mexico, I think there's opportunity there for us to rethink that in a way that values us and provides the support as we're doing our work.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I wanted to, Dolores, get your thoughts on, what Michelle was lifting up around leadership and the support that women of color really need from one another and to hold that space. And if you were to share advice or give some words of wisdom to a young woman of color coming into the sector, or even someone just new to philanthropy, what would you share with them?
Thank you, and thank you, Michelle, for your thoughts on the subject, which I completely agree with. I'd like to add that it has not always been like this. I am the senior person here and have had to be the trailblazer in many situations where I was the youngest, the only female, the only person of color. I have followed men into the men's restroom because I was so annoyed that they would go in there when I was the only, again, woman, on the board and discuss things. And I had it, I followed, and they stopped doing it, but I've had to do things like that. I, had to not tell someone that I was pregnant when I was offered a pretty high level supervisory position in my home community, even though there was a law that protected pregnant women, it didn't mean anything to this Hispanic, very traditional male. And so I had to prove that I could do the job being pregnant, but there was no family leave, you know, there were none of those protections. So things have changed. And I think that, you know, there are a couple of things that are evolving where we can learn from our male counterparts. And one of them has to do with mentorship. We need to move beyond just mentoring and look at sponsorships. And that's the difference between advising someone and advocating for someone. And I'm happy to say that I've had both. And I've had many sponsors, such as my good friend who has passed, Facundo Valdez, who was one of my professors who advocated for me. He was the one that started the social work department at New Mexico Highlands. I think we also, you know, we have to be bold. We have to not stand back because someone feels that there's some kind of stereotypical, you know, role that we have. We have to be bold. Follow someone into the restroom. Maybe not now, but, you know, I'm giving an example that, you know, live your beliefs, stand up for what you believe. Do not stand for injustice. Do not stand for disrespect. And I think that those lessons are as true 40 years ago when I started as they are now. There are still many, many barriers that we have to overcome. Change your personnel policies. You know, I added at Conalma before I left, paid family leave. Come on, people. We have to raise families together, not just women. Change your policies. You know, do those kinds of things that make a difference. Have a family-friendly office. Don't let staff, you know, leave the office just because their kid is sick, but encourage them to leave when their child has a words program. You know, we have to change the culture, remove the barriers, be bold.
Thank you for sharing the bold solutions, Dolores, and the work that you've done. And I'm just reflecting on the chat right now and just all of the questions that are coming in and the comments about how important it is to hear from you all and your experiences in terms of what you've had to do to meet the challenges, to lean into opportunities, and really hold that space for yourself as a woman of color, and then also for other women of color that are coming into this sector and doing work not only in philanthropy, but in nonprofit work and systems change work. So thank you for that. You know, before we open it up to questions, we've got some questions that have been coming in. We want to have time for those. But, you know, I wanted to ask JoAnn if you had any thoughts on, you know, what are some of the bold solutions that you would like to see as we think about addressing the leadership gap that exists?
So I really appreciate everything that both Michelle and Dolores have mentioned. I echo a lot of what they've mentioned, and it is important to be bold in your work and your approach with people. And I would say, I would add to what they've said, just stay true to your values. You know, if you are strong and if you want to help your communities, you know, just stay strong in that and things will work out. I wrote down what's important, I would say, are developing partnerships. I also had mentorships and collaborations. Going back to what I said earlier about working together, you need to work together. You can't do this work alone. And so if you're able to reach out to your mentors, and I have several mentors that I've had over the years, and I still count on them to help support me in my work. And just, set up your network, set up your support system to help you to do that. And I am really happy to say that my 90-year-old grandma, whom I live with, she is my support. And every day she reminds me, be who you are, stay strong in your values, and always reach out and try to work with everyone that you come across in your work. So, my approach is that, you can't do this work alone. You have to reach out, let's support one another and create that network. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Joanne. Nichole, did you have any thoughts to share before we open up the floor for questions?
Sure, thank you. I echo everything that the lady said, and now I'm like, what? I was gonna say, no, I'm just joking. I think the thing for me that I think maybe wasn't mentioned is how do we stop seeing each other as women and women of color as competition? And I know that people are gonna be like, oh, is she gonna go there? I'm gonna go there, because that is a thing that I've experienced, even in learning, in asking people for help and going to people. Are you yourself willing to share your knowledge? Or do you hoard that knowledge for yourself in your own organization because you see others as competition, right? Instead of pushing each other up and sharing the knowledge freely for each other so that we could learn and not, I'm really good at listening to wisdom. I really am, I promise. It's just who's willing to share that wisdom. And I think that is why we have knowledge gaps sometimes in our leadership, and leadership gaps is because we're each one teach one, right? The principle, African proverb principle of each one teach one. That's what we need more of, and not seeing each other as women of color in competition with each other, because we're not. There's enough work to go around for us to crack the code on some of these issues facing our community. I think that's the only one I would add and echo all the other things that the other lady said. Thank you.
Thank you all again for sharing your stories, for being willing, for being honest. Really grateful to hold this space for you all today and for your leadership. We've got some questions that have come in, and so we're going to go ahead and get through these. So we've got a question from Amy Whitfield. So the comment and then a question. When BIPOC women earn their way into executive leadership, they are often overlooked at BIPOC communities and white communities to be the voice of justice and inclusion. Sorry, they are often looked at to be the voice of justice and inclusion. But far too often they are out there as a solo voice and hear thank you. Okay, speaking up and being this voice can put their job and future career opportunities at risk. What can your foundations and others do to protect BIPOC executives when they're putting their livelihood at risk and speaking their truth? So that's one question. And, maybe Michelle, if you want to share your thoughts on that first, and we'll get your responses, and then we'll move on to another question.
Thanks, Amy. That's that's a hard question. I don't have a good response for you. I think one thing that the Kellogg Foundation, the reason I joined the Kellogg Foundation was because of their commitment to racial equity. And I think we can all agree, racial equity, there's a spectrum, and right, we're all on a path, but we're all not in the same place. And so Kellogg is on this journey of racial equity. And I'm able to actually say that and go into meetings and talk about race and to ask questions about race and figure out what the commitment looks like in terms of race. And so when it comes to, I think, the executives, we value BIPOC leadership, and we're trying to support BIPOC leadership. But in terms of like the specifics of protections, I don't know if that's something that we would be able to do, but it's definitely, we do try and focus on increasing BIPOC leadership at that level. And also funding organizations that are doing racial equity work. And so it may be within the organization itself to start to do some of those pieces of work. And I don't know if I just mentioned or not, but we also look at like board composition. And so if an organization is not diverse, you may still receive funding, but we're going to ask some hard questions around commitment to racial equity and diversification of your board. So I know that that was a roundabout, not direct answer. That was a hard question, but thank you for asking.
Any other thoughts on that, or we can move on to another question? Anything anyone wants to share?
I just want to echo Amy's question. I think that it's deep because especially Black women, I think this one hits hard. We're often the only in the room, or, you know, offices of one to do the work for the whole Black community, which we're not a monolith. So not one person could represent us all, right? And I think that when we advocate, she's absolutely right, when we advocate for our community, when we are the bold ones saying the things that need to be said, it often puts a target on our back. And I don't know what could be done to protect us other than the community holding organizations accountable when we don't support our leaders, execs of color, you know, checking people in the moment when things come up in meetings. I know this happens with me all the time, where you have to, you know, have people feel comfortable speaking up for yourself. But maybe if you're an ally in those situations and you see that happening, you can speak up and kind of help to take that target off of us, because it's definitely a real thing, and it's a tough question. So you're right, Michelle. There's not a great answer for it, but I think I just wanted to echo Amy. I feel you on that one.
So we've got another question that came in here, and Dolores, you started to address this in your last comments around things like family-friendly spaces, changing personnel policies. Are there other things that that you have seen within your organization that address the historic inequities that exist? And so I'd like to get your thoughts, Dolores, and then I'd like to, JoAnn, get your thoughts as well on this question.
Yes, thank you. There are many, but it has to start by having it be at the center. And what that means is that it has to be institutionalized, not just in policies, but in practices, in behavior, in core values. And it could be as, you know, something as, for example, way back when people had to make copies of proposals and bring them in, we got this little couple from Taos who drove to Taos to Santa Fe, brought their little hard copy proposal, and it wasn't accepted by my front office person because there weren't 5 copies. Instead of handling that poorly, I simply got up and went and made the copies and said, you know, not to worry, thank you so much for coming over, and you know, just took care of it by modeling it. I didn't have to do anything else. It was, you know, just an example of how you treat people with respect by using common sense. And that's, you know, institutionalizing some of, again, those power dynamics that happen on a daily basis that people think it might be minor, but it's not. It has to be institutionalized in everything that you do. And you have to believe it as a core value, and you have to understand that equity, diversity, and inclusion, these are not programs that you can marginalize. These are philosophies. These are assets. These are what make organizations stronger. And so in order to address inequity, we have to have that framework of equity. And again, if you understand that it's in everything you do, kind of like health in all policies, right? Then it makes it easier to answer that question, because again, institutionalized means it's something that is always there, it's pervasive.
JoAnn, I'd like to, and thank you, Dolores, for sharing that. Your thoughts on this particular question.
I would say that I think that as racial equity has come up, especially in the past few years, I saw a lot of organizations, immediately putting out statements of what they value, what they believe. But you often, or I would often wonder, is that really true? Does that resonate throughout the entire organization? And so I always say that, don't make changes just to make change. Do it from your heart, do it from what you value. And I do agree, it has to be institutionalized. You have to look at the values and then also make sure that it happens throughout all aspects of your organization, all the way from the board to board committees to your staff, and then incorporating that into your strategic plans, for the organization, and constantly reviewing, what, is that working? Do you need to make changes? And how do you make those adjustments when you need to? Because I always feel that if you're doing work in the community is going to know if you're doing that work from your heart. If you're really saying, I want to treat you fairly, I want to do this for you, community is, they're going to know that, if you're true and, or if you're just saying words just to meet some, statement out there. So it goes back to, I think, the work that I've done with youth throughout my career, in that youth are always honest, and I always relate that back to community members or communities, that they're going to be honest too. And if you as an organization is not working from your heart or from core values that are important to the community, they're going to know, and they're not going to trust the work that you're trying to do for them. So I think it really is important that you do that work from your heart and from those values.
Thank you. We've got another question that came in here. I just put it in the chat. And Nichole, I'd like to start with you. How do you begin preparing yourself to move into an upper level position? I feel like I've been overlooked too many times and it gets frustrating. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I have a phone and a computer going. A hard question, but a very good question. I'll just share. I was very worried about applying to the Kellogg Foundation. It's a large national foundation, and was I going to be prepared to move into the program officer role? And it was at the same time that I was going through that New Mexico Leadership Women of Color Institute. And a couple of things that they did, I don't know if these will help, but maybe they will. They had us redo our bios, and not like the bios where you're listing all of our accolades, which are important, but really who are you? What do you want people to know about you? And then we had our sisters kind of review those for us. And that really made a difference to me, because I felt like when I finally was sharing my bio, it was really the essence of who I am. And so part of that is tied to just confidence, right? And recognizing, I think as women of color, we are constantly second guessing ourselves all the time. And so having that support system that's going to just review everything and make sure that, it looks good, but that it's really reflecting you, I think is important. And then the other piece, just the second one, was the negotiation around pay. So we work in the nonprofit sector, and, it's almost like, well, just whatever you can pay me, because I'm just really happy to do this for the community. But the point is that you are a professional, and you should receive expertise or compensation for your expertise. And I think that that's one thing that really is hard for our communities. I'll just say for the Latina community, where we're martyrs for everything that we do, is that we do not ask for what we are worth. And so having, and I'll just share really briefly, but the person that spoke to us, she actually told me, as I was contemplating, what should I do? And she's like, if you don't ask for what you're worth, you are hurting your two daughters. And I had never thought about it that way, because I'm always thinking I'm trying to fight for my kids and take care of my kids and do better by the future. So for me to actually think about I'm harming them, I myself am harming my children, really made me shift my perception about what that meant. And so I went into that meeting as well as other interviews, and I asked for what I was worth. And so I know it's hard to get into those leadership positions, but no doubt you can do it and you have the expertise. But some of those little things may help to just, get you into the place that you need to be.
Thank you, Nichole. I know that there are more questions that have come in that we will not be able to get to. I'm super grateful for our attendees for being present, for sharing. I'd like to give our panelists an opportunity to share some closing thoughts before we finish up our webinar today. So this time has gone quick. I'm looking at the clock, and I want to make sure that we end on time for folks. So I'm going to, go ahead and ask Dolores to start us off with sharing some closing thoughts, and then I'll go to you, Nichole, after.
Thank you. And again, thank you all for participating in this and for organizing and for all that you do. My closing sentence is, "Sí se puede." And I think everyone has heard that saying, which is Spanish for yes, we can. But what maybe you don't know is that the slogan actually came from Dolores Huerta, not Cesar Chavez. She did it in support of him and his fast, but she's the one who was the co-founder of the United Farm Workers who came up with it. And it's something that really resonates with me. I'm an anomaly. I've never had a shortage of self-confidence. And I think that Sí se puede is something that can continue to inspire us. Mil gracias.
Thank you, Dolores. Nichole.
My closing thoughts is I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to have met these wonderful women that I will be tapping into for some mentorship, just a heads up, since we're going to be bold, Dolores, and ask for what we want, Michelle, right? So I'm learning as I'm here, and I'm grateful. And I just want to, hopefully someone in the audience is inspired to do this work, because there's a lot of work to do. And I am just hopeful from having this conversation that we together can crack this code and figure out how to help our communities that are suffering and in the most need now, because that is where we're at. So I just hope that there are other folks that are inspired to join us in making sure we have families and communities that can have what they need to thrive, not just survive. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Nichole. Michelle, I'd love to get your closing thoughts, and then we'll finish up with you, Joanne.
Just that Dolores taught me when I started that we're all part of the same sector. We're all part of the nonprofit sector. We are on the same team. And so as much as, the world tries to divide philanthropy from nonprofits, we are the same team doing the same work, which is to take care of our communities. That's our responsibility. And so, I'm just really grateful, like Nichole said, to be able to work with you all and to do this work together.
Thank you. Joanne, your closing thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Alicia and Catherine, for hosting this session. I've been really looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists. And to me, it's about making sure that we continue to learn, to help each other, to collaborate, and to this work isn't done, and we are going to need to continue to reach out and support one another. So I am here if you need me, and if there's any way that I can help, I'm happy to do that. And in my language, I would say, it's a meaning that we are doing this work to have impact in our communities, to create strong communities. Thank you. Naitra, thank you.
Thank you. Really, really honored and grateful to be in space with you all today. Grateful to all of the folks that signed up and registered to be a part of us today. Seeing your names and your comments and questions in the chat just really, lets me know and lets all of us know how important it is to hold space for these conversations. They've been inspiring. I've learned a lot. And I'm so grateful to each and every one of you for being here today and for sharing your stories. So thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Nichole, Michelle, Dolores, for saying yes when I reached out, and for all of your wisdom and your words today. Really grateful. And Building Movement Project thanks you as well. So before we close off today, I wanted to share one last slide with some resources that you can take a look at. If you go to our website, buildingmovementproject.org, a number of reports, testimonials, videos. We are going to be preparing to do another webinar in the future on the work that we are doing around Move the Money. And so you can actually Google that as well. But the websites to the various reports that I referenced earlier today are on the screen today. They can all be downloaded. There's a wealth of information there for you to take a look at. So we encourage you to do that. Again, thank you. My name is Alicia Lueras Maldonado, here with the Building Movement Project team for our conversation today, Women in Philanthropy in New Mexico. Thank you all. Have a blessed day. Super grateful. Signing off.